Essentially, um, or actually page 11, the second to the last page, but at the bottom, halfway down. Because last week we looked at some of the materials that are used, that have been found in many of the ancient documents, manuscripts. Showed some pictures of those, of the materials used by the Bible writers. I just want to deal briefly and go through the material on the biblical languages. I think it's going to be something that some things that you've known about, especially since I kind of give a lot of emphasis to language just in teaching and preaching anyway, so I think you're pretty familiar with a lot of that, but we will be getting right into lesson 3 and evidence and the collection, and starting to get to the really exciting type of evidence as far as archaeology and so forth, and we'll be looking at that for the next couple of weeks as well. Bryce is going to lead us in a word of prayer before we begin our discussion. Let's pray.
Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for another opportunity to gather together and have a study. We ask that you be with each and every one of us here, that we can take what we learned tonight and apply it to our lives in whatever manner is appropriate. We also ask that you be with Brent as he presents the material tonight, that we would be able to understand it and comprehend it easily, and that the material would be clear to each and every person here tonight. We love you so much, God, and the whole reason we're here is because of your Son. And we're so thankful to you for what he's done for us and the love that you showed by sending him to die on the cross for us. We pray that you be with us all this evening and keep us safe. And we pray all these things in his name. Amen.
Amen. When it comes to looking at the development of the Bible, the Word of God, particularly as we will give our attention at first to the Old Testament, we recognize that the information that we can gather and what we know historically, archaeologically about language is a big factor. It's an important factor when it comes to the validation or to the legitimacy of Scripture, because of the history of language itself. And that's a fascinating thing, because I know that in some of the research that I've done in the past with various kinds of languages, and particularly the languages that were being developed and spoken in the ancient times, what we would think of biblical times, maybe in the times of Moses or in the days of Abraham or even before, that we really know that languages developed, and yet originally, even from the very beginning of time, there just seems to be language that appears, and we can only go back so far when it comes to archaeology and finding written language, for example, and only can go so far in knowing of the development of languages. And to me, what's very important about that is Genesis chapter 11. Let's all take our Bibles and turn to Genesis chapter 11. And this is an account that I think we're all very familiar with. Of course, what significant event has just taken place basically in Genesis chapters 6 through 9? What's the significant event there, Vance? You got the flood. And with the flood, what's fascinating to me about that is that when Noah and his wife and sons and their wives get off the ark, that's it for humanity. 8 people. What language did they speak? English. I wasn't expecting that. But looking at the source, but anyway, English. Okay, that was funny though. The thing is, we don't really know. And Noah didn't write anything. The thing that we have to remember is that who wrote the first 5 books of the Bible? Who wrote the Pentateuch? Moses did. Now, what historically, chronologically, is Moses' relationship, chronologically, let's say from the birth of Moses essentially back to, let's say, the Garden of Eden, as far as the expulsion of Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden. Chronologically, how much time do we have that has transpired from the garden expulsion to the time of Moses' life anyway? How many years do we have approximately there, would you say?
1,500. 25. Too much?
About 2,500. So you have about 2,500 years. Because then from Moses to Christ, we have 1,500 years. So here's Moses. Now, in the biblical account and some of the most ancient accounts that we have of this history, although there have been some early Egyptian dynasty things that are found, but understand that those are during the days of Moses and even years after Moses. But Moses is writing about things that took place from anywhere from at least 2,500 years before he was on the earth up to about 400 years, or to that time, even into the life of Joseph. Now we know that when Moses wrote the Pentateuch in those books, and we know that they were written, what language would that have been? What language would Moses, what language would that have been? That would be Hebrew. That would be Hebrew. Now you understand that there are various forms of the Hebrew language. And like a lot of languages can change, and you have these periods of time. We're going to be looking at that in a little while when we get the archaeology stuff in section 3, even when it comes to language. But Moses is the one that's writing about these accounts, but he's writing to whom? To Jews, to the children of Israel, to the Hebrew people. And so we look at this, and he does not tell us, and the Genesis account does not tell us the language of which they spoke, but obviously there was communication, there was a spoken language. When we come to Genesis chapter 11, after chapter 10, in which genealogies are given, because now there's a period of time that has lapsed. Chapter 9, God makes covenants with humanity to Noah, these universal covenants in chapter 9, after they get off the ark. We understand that when you look at chapter 9 verse 18, it will speak about these sons and daughters that will be born to the sons and their wives of Noah, and daughters-in-law, and to Noah, and they're going to be these descendants. And then chapter 10 is going to give a record of these various nations of these descendants that are going to be coming from Noah. Now we also know something else that's very interesting about this, that we know that in the very beginning of the patriarchal age, that man was living for these extended periods of time. I mean, we think it's extended. It was just what it was at the time. Who was it, the oldest man to live that we have record of? Methuselah. He lived to be how old? 969 years old. Now we know that after Noah gets off the ark, and God is not going to strive with man quite as long when it comes to years, basically age is going to take a major reduction from these very, very lengthy, where people could live 800-900 years, and basically it was reduced to what?
120.
About 120 years, right.
Noah was 650 years old when he came off the ark.
Right.
Another 300 years, and probably sired many more children.
Many more children. And that's why we have the genealogies at the end of 9 and into 10. But with that, you have to take this into consideration. A lot of time is passing by, correct? Just like before, think about how much time passed by in the days of Adam and Eve and of Seth and of all those generations when they're living 800 and 900 years. Then you've got all of this time that is going by. Well, now we have more time that's going by, even though man's days are reduced some, but still we have a lot of time going by. And that's why the book of Genesis is the only book that really covers the period of the patriarchal age, technically. I mean, the first few chapters of Exodus would, obviously, in that transition. But yet the book of Genesis covers more time than any other section of the Bible does. Because Exodus up through the Old Testament is 1,500 years. We have the 400-year period of silence between Malachi and John the Baptist. And then we understand that the New Testament, really the New Testament, from the gospel accounts right through the book of Revelation, it really is, roughly speaking, only covering what period of time? How many years are covered, basically, Matthew through Revelation? Yeah, about 100 years. So the point I'm making is going back, in this development of time in the book of Genesis, you've got all these years going by, these new generations of people, and there's a common language that is spoken. We can only but assume that Noah and his wife and his sons and their wives and the children that they have, we can only assume that they're continuing to speak the language that they were speaking before the flood anyway. Right? We have no indication. In fact, we have evidence from Genesis 11 to show that up to this period of time in Genesis 11, that man was speaking one language. Okay? Now we come to chapter 11, Genesis 11, where I asked you to go to. In verse 1, now the whole earth had one language in the same words. Now be reminded, Moses is writing this 2,500 years, give or take. But he's writing this a good number of years after this is really taking place. I mean, this particular thing wouldn't be 2,500 years, but it would be a lot of years, a lot of centuries. 2,500 years would take us back to Eden. But as we march in the book of Genesis, we're getting further and further into time, right? So I don't want to mischaracterize that. But the point is, there's a lot of centuries that have passed by when Moses is writing about this history. And what Moses lets the children of Israel, his people, know, because this is a record that was written for them. And he's writing this from a perspective, he wants the children of Israel to know, here is what happened. From creation to Adam and Eve, to Cain and Abel, to you just name it, to Noah, to Abraham, to all of these things, important information. But he's writing to them there so that they will have this perspective of history. So he writes in this text, now the whole earth had one language in the same words, and as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they'll have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down. And one of the rare occasions that deity is speaking, and did you notice the pronoun that he uses there? Let us, the plural pronoun. And so he says, come, let us go down, and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispersed them from over the face of all the earth. And they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. Now, there's a couple of interesting things there. There could be a couple of different possible meanings when you say all over the face of the earth. That could have very well been the Mesopotamian world. Okay, think about the Mesopotamian Valley, the Tigris Euphrates River, and those rivers that flow down into the Persian Gulf. And basically, because we know in that world, and then even coming west, because we know that where did the ark, Noah's ark, where did it end up being? Yes, the Ararat Mountains. So we get the general idea of the geography and the type of world this was, even west of the Mesopotamian Valley. But you've got Noah's family and they are populating, and many sons and daughters are being born to these people from generation to generation to generation. Not that dissimilar from what happened in the days of Adam and Eve, because chapter 5 says in Genesis 5 that Adam and Eve had other sons and daughters. And can you imagine the exponential factor that even then, when they're living that long, they're very prolific, they're having sons and daughters, and then over a period, because look at this, we're talking over a period of several centuries, just in those first few chapters of Genesis, there's going to be a population boom, correct? But what we get from the sense of Genesis 11 is that how many languages were they speaking during all this period of time? One. And we can absolutely logically understand and assume that whatever language Noah and his family were speaking when they boarded the ark, and approximately a year later as they disembarked, got off the ark, they're speaking that language. And now sons and daughters are being born into the family of Noah, and they're learning that language. And this is the language that they know, and it is going to be some kind of ancient. I wouldn't even necessarily say that, is it Mesopotamian? Is it Sumerian? Is it, later would be the development of Phoenician languages. There's going to be a whole variety of languages, but back then there was one language, and they spoke the same words. Bryce?
My version says had one language and one speech. Is there any distinction there?
I think it's a reiteration because, again, what could very well be written, referring to both written and oral, verbal, and language and speech. Speech obviously comes across as being very verbal, very oral, all right? And that's another great, interesting study is the development of written languages. But one thing that we know in Genesis 11 is that we have one language and one thing that is being spoken. Now, but look what God has done in chapter 11. So when you go ahead and take linguistics in any major university, and you study linguistics, and you study the history of languages, and I'm not talking about etymology or just the nuances of language, but I'm just saying the history of language itself. We're only going to be able to go back so far. And even as some of these ancient languages that are referred to in the Bible, then we know that we can only go back as far as just a couple of thousand years BC, which makes sense. Okay? Now, what the Lord has done is He has confounded the language. He's caused man to be spread all over what is called the face of the earth. So whatever that was. Now, if God put people all over the planet, that's God's doing. But it doesn't have to be that, because this could, a lot of times, even preaching the gospel throughout the world in the New Testament could very well refer to the Roman Empire. You see what I'm saying? In the face of the earth. But here's the thing, is that these languages that came about, how did they come about? So all of a sudden we go from one language, and then we have this great event in the Tower of Babel, and the next thing you know, what do we have? What two great factors do we have? Right after the Tower of Babel event, what do we have? What are the two factors? Number one, what? Confusion, all these different languages. And number two, the dispersion, people all over the place. And these people, wherever they were geographically, God made it so that these people are speaking a language. These people are speaking a language. And these people are speaking a language. And somebody says, well, how can that be? Well, how can that be? It's called a miracle. As we talk about these miracles, these other curious anomalies that take place, that the very God, that when Adam and Eve are in the Garden of Eden, first of all, do we see that the Lord is communicating with Adam and Eve? What language was that? And what language were Adam and Eve themselves speaking? We just don't know. But all we can assume by Genesis 11, that whatever language God gave naturally to Adam and Eve, and then these descendants of Adam and Eve, they are all speaking these languages, right? They're speaking these languages. But now, because God has seen what men, and it is an interesting point as a side note, even God makes the observation that when man is truly united in cause, united in language, united in purpose, What can man accomplish? Oh, just about anything. Now we're reminded, why were they building this tower though? And don't go with the old stuff that we learned in denominational Sunday schools. Why were they building this tower? To do what? Make a name for themselves. Oh, let us build a tower that reaches into the heavens, into the sky. But it says to make a name for themselves. They didn't do it to glorify God. They did it to glorify self. And God saw their ability, and He's going to confound the language. And so it's very, very interesting that we can only go back so far linguistically and archaeologically with all of the work that's been historically with linguistics. And you're only going to go so far, and then it becomes very fuzzy about the development of certain languages. It becomes very, very fuzzy. Elizabeth.
In verse 4 at the end,
Of Genesis 11:4? Yeah.
When they say, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. Did they know that that was going to be like a consequence, or because then that's what happened?
Well, it's what Moses seems to indicate.
Right.
He seems to indicate that, and who knows, is it because it's a population thing too, and that they would be dispersed? Don't know for sure. Yeah. Thought about that many, many, many times, lest we become dispersed, and God does disperse them. Okay. But they knew something, but the whole point, and that's a great question, but the point is, what they're doing, though, again, is for themselves, to let us make a name for ourselves, and God's going to put a stop to this tower building project. Stops it cold. Okay. Now, these languages. By the way, there's something else that becomes very interesting too, I think, in this great miracle. And that's not only the development of language and the dispersion to people in various geographic places, but there's another very interesting, a third situation, Ellen, and what is that? Race. And when we talk about that, race as, not determined, but race as manifested or demonstrated how? I mean, just from the difference of skin coloration to bone structure to a lot of different things that go on, because the age-old question has always been, if man came from Adam and Eve, and that went for a while, and then it was almost destroyed, and then man starts back up again with Noah and his wife and family, the question becomes, where did these races come from? Because we have all these different differentiations by what human beings look like. Well, here we can see this is certainly a logical answer in the biblical narrative, that what you have in the development of races and looks. Again, do we have miraculous things going on to begin with? Well, of course. And so it would be the logical answer to that. Okay? And by the way, too, because as far back as we can go with languages from a linguistical, historical standpoint, is that we go to these areas like Mesopotamia and to the Semitic, and they had Southern Semitic, and they had Northern Semitic, and they had especially Northwestern Semitic, where you're going to have the development of the Hebrew language and eventually the Aramaic language. But they also had Egyptian and Ethiopian languages, Northern Africa languages that we can go back. But look at that. Look what that's all central to into the biblical narrative and picture. All right there. Just as much as scientists believe today that the cradle of civilization is in the Mesopotamian Valley, right where the Garden of Eden has been placed to begin with. So, I mean, a lot of these things, you look at this is not a coincidence of how those things are stationed there. Okay. Now, what are the three languages that we normally talk about then when it comes to biblical languages then? The biblical languages. What are the three languages? We've been talking one about Hebrew already. What are the other two? Greek and Aramaic. All right, so when you look at the material here, on page 11, the languages of the Bible, originally the Bible was written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Hebrew, most of the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. A Semitic language akin to Aramaic, Syriac, Akkadian, Arabic. Semitic languages are written from right to left. Different forms of Hebrew present a problem and sometimes are confused by even the well-trained eye. There are no vowels in the alphabet, even though in some documents vowel points have been added. Until about 200 BC, the Jews used the form of the letters found in the Phoenician inscriptions, a form in which letters have an angular, or some will say square shape, an angular shape. This is the form used in the writing of earlier Hebrew documents, such as the Siloam inscription, the Lachish letters. The Moabite stone and other inscriptions are written in other varieties of Canaanite. I mean, that's the Moabite stone which was archaeologically found. The square-shaped letters characters were taken over by the Jews for the writing of both Hebrew and Aramaic about 200 BC. In addition, biblical Hebrew literature is not characterized by abstractions, but rather with facts of experience. Indirect or philosophical composition is unknown. Now it says by facts or experience. What ancient language do we often talk about when we use the term hieroglyphics? Egyptian and the various Egyptian dynasties. And so many linguists and scholars believe that the alphabet of the Hebrew and Aramaic alphabet, now you have two different languages that are very closely related. And you have the ancient Hebrew language that no doubt was a spoken language, a Semitic language, and in time there is a development of an alphabet and of writing this language, and it very much appears that this alphabet was able to come from some other languages. Some believe that it was that the Phoenician was an offshoot of some of the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics anyway. So again, when you look at this and you look at these letters, and you're going to see that there's a repetition of a couple of the letters because they have what's called they have a normal position and a final position, and I'll explain that in just a moment. This is going to be very, very brief. But we would start at the top and go right to left in that order. It goes the Aleph, the Beit, the Gimel. Now, when you look at the Gimel, interesting, that's the third one from the left. And I should have brought my whiteboard. I could have done that and drawn some pictures. But it's interesting because in Hebrew, the Hebrew word for camel is gamal. And there's the thought that in a picture form of writing the hieroglyphics, that the gamal was formed, which is, by the way, kind of equivalent to our G, but that it was looked somewhat like what a camel would look like. One of the most popular words in Hebrew language, and just found so many times an important word to Hebrew culture, is house, Beit. And you look at Beit, and the word for house is Ba'ith. And this is Beit. But you look at this, and what they look like today were remarkably different what they looked like 3,000 years ago. Just like English letters, and somebody was in Mark Miller was in my office the other day, and others have done this too. He said, Brent, where's that document you keep talking about, Erasmus's paraphrase? And so he went over there and trying to read the thing. And he was having great difficulty, and it was written in English. But the shape of the letters are different. When that was written in 1524, I have an original page from Erasmus's paraphrase in 1524, and those letters, and not only the spelling was different, the shape of the letters is different, and he says, what gives? And I said, well, you have to work at it. Okay, so we have this language, the Aleph, Beit, the Gimel, the Daled, the Hey, the Wow, which is the W, the Zayin, the Kaif is that real throaty thing, the Tay. By the way, we have a couple of T's, and then we have the Yod, two forms of the Kaf. So see where it says K-A-F, Kaf? So the next one's a Kaf too, but Kaf Sophia, because anytime a word ends with a Kaf, you have to use its final form. And that's that one like that, and it would come below a line. So Kaf, look how the Kaf and how much the Beit look kind of alike, but there's a little beak on the Beit where there's not a Kaf. Can you imagine then in transcription of the biblical record and all the scribes, how they had to meticulously at times, even the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, do you understand how difficult it was because those were handwritten? And you know what? Have any of you ever tried, you can read my printing pretty good, but let me write out a document in cursive and then I'll give it to you to read, and good luck. Okay? Because sometimes, people's writing can be different. So anyway, they have what's called the final form. the Lamed, which is the L. We have two forms of the Mem, which is our M, the regular form, the final form. Then two forms of the Nun, which is our N, that form and the final form. The Samik, which is one of the S's. The Ayin. And by the way, we have a couple of letters in Hebrew that actually don't technically have a sound unless you vowel point it. That's the Aleph. Don't think it's like an A or an A. The Aleph really has no sound until you understand what the vowel point is to be there. And the same is true with the Ayin. You have the Pe, which is the P. You have the Fi, the Sadeh. And the Sadeh, its regular form, its final form. And then you have, we had the Kaf up there, but now we have the Kof here. Also very hard K. You've got the Chef up there, but a Kof and a Kaf. The Resh. There are two forms it should have shown here on the Sheen. You have the Sheen and the Seen. And that's what looks like the W like that. Are you with me? Are you staying with me on where I'm going? And so if I put a dot over the right point, it's a Sheen. If I put a dot over the left point, it's a Seen. So sh, tus. And then the final letter, which is another T sound, is the tau. So you know how we always say in Greek, we say from the alpha to the what? But in Hebrew, we say from the aleph to the tau. So technically speaking, you have 22 letters. It's just some of those letters have two forms. Okay? Now, Aramaic shares this alphabet, though it's a different language, but they're very, very close. But they're different languages. And I think I've given the illustration before. Well, there's a lot of languages that have various dialects even, but Aramaic is not a dialect of Hebrew. It's a different language. Inasmuch as Portuguese is really not a dialect of Spanish. Portuguese is Portuguese. But do they share a lot of commonalities? They do. So, with the Aramaic, there are some portions of the Old Testament that's not in Hebrew, and it's listed on here when you go read through that material. There's some portions that are in Aramaic in the Old Testament, and there are a few phrases in the New Testament, and Jesus would have very much. Jesus and the Jewish people of Jesus' day, what language do you think that as Jews they primarily spoke? Aramaic. Exactly, whoever said that. Aramaic is what they spoke. And in most of Jesus' preaching, he would have spoken Aramaic. But the New Testament writers, for the most part, they wrote their books and letters in what language? Greek. And Paul wrote, it's very well understood that Paul wrote in a very, very pure form of Greek in his letter to the Romans. All right. And by the way, what kind of Greek was that specifically? Koine, which means common. And you'll find that word in the New Testament as we discovered in class last night with Jude 3. He said, I write of you the koine soter, the common salvation. Right? And so, now, I just want to quickly show them. So that's Aramaic and Hebrew alphabet. Then, when we come to the Greek alphabet, and you'll have some, we look at this, and we've got these, I think it's 24 letters, isn't it? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. Yeah, there's 24 letters in the Greek alphabet. And so there we have, makes for a good grocery store, alpha, beta, right? But we have alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, zeta, eta, theta, iota, kappa, lambda, mu, nu, psi, omicron, pi, you say pi? Pi, in Greek, it's pi. Rho, sigma, tau, upsilon, phi, chi, psi, omega. Has two O's. I'm a purist when it comes to that the long O is an omega. When you have an omicron, it's more soft. That is omicron. But there again, now the difference is this linguistically, historically, is not, this is a type of lettering that really doesn't seem to be any hieroglyphic indications to it at all. But like all these languages, you go back and you start looking and you'll see it's taken on different forms through the years. But now today in our computers and our books that we publish and so forth, that we have to use letters that we can identify. By the way, when I teach Greek to our trainees, we actually write these symbols, especially a few of the letters, significantly different than what you will get on a computer or on a Greek typewriter. Because we go back and use the old Koine Greek symbol. One of the greatest examples of that would be the theta. If you come down here to the left-hand side. And by the way, Greek is like us, like English. It reads from left to right. Okay? But the theta, and you'll see that the theta a lot of times. Oh, by the way, what it shows on the left-hand side of both those columns are the capitals. The one to the right are the lowercase. I should have said that. So in the manuscripts, and a few of them very, very important, but more than that, but we have some important Greek manuscripts that are called uncials. And the uncials, one of the characteristics of the uncials is that those manuscripts are written in all caps. And not only are they written in all caps, when you look at the Sinaiticus, the Vaticanus, and the Alexandrinus, that when you look at those types of codices, you'll find also with some of these that not only are they all caps, there's no spaces between the words and sentences and paragraphs. It reminds me of those puzzles they give you as kids. Find the word, circle the words. It's got all these letters, kids love doing that. So you kind of have to, So can you imagine you're just trying to learn Greek, and then you're given this and say, now read that and translate that. It can be problematic. And we need to be thankful to people that have devoted their entire lives to learning this stuff. You know what I'm saying? They didn't have a life. I read some of these reference works and these books these guys do, and I thought, was this guy married and having any kids? And never saw him, I don't think. But anyway. So you can read the information there on Hebrew and Aramaic and on the Greek, because there's some good examples that are in that. I do want to show you, if you go to on page 11, number 2 of the Aramaic at the bottom of page 11, where it says that, just read, after the time of the Babylonian exile, 500 BC, Aramaic became the tongue of the common people in Palestine. The parts of the Old Testament not written in Hebrew are written in Aramaic. This includes a place name in Genesis 31:47 that very clearly what was included there in the name of that place was an Aramaic expression or spelling. And it gives some other examples of that. Kind of interesting that when you look late books like Daniel and Ezra, because those are late books, because that takes us to the period of basically, we understand, like with Ezra, what's the book of Ezra all about? The building of what? The temple. Nehemiah would be the building of the walls, Ezra would be building up, but we're getting late in that history, and there is going to be a greater influence of the Aramaic language being spoken by those people. Okay? So anyway, I just wanted to bring that to your attention. And then if you go to the next page on Greek, although the spoken language, because we got to close here, although the spoken language of Jesus was probably Aramaic, the books which comprise our New Testament were written in Greek, as I said earlier, or more correctly termed Hellenistic, or Koine Common. So how many of you have heard of the term Hellenistic? And the idea, because think of Helen of Troy, and look at that Macedonian history. Philip the Macedon was the father to what great historical figure? Alexander the Great. And so you look at this period of time, and the Grecian culture, language, arts, education, science, literature was so heavy, such an influence, that it permeated all these other societies. Because don't forget, Alexander the Great was conquering the world anyway, wasn't he? And so you understand that when we come to the New Testament times, it's the Roman Empire, but the early Roman Empire, or even earlier than that, the Roman Republic, short-lived as it was, but is all very, very greatly influenced by Grecian, and that's Hellenism. You even had Hellenistic Jews. That is, there was Jewish blood flowing through their veins, but they were born into this Hellenist society, spoke the Greek language, educated in many, many respects. And those are spoken of in Acts chapter 6. Remember, there arose a complaint by whom? The Grecian Jews, because some of their widows were being neglected. So the common language, it was almost more of a street I'm not going to say guttural language so much, but more of a street language, very common language, that Jesus knew would have spoken, the apostles, New Testament people knew and spoke, was this Koine Greek. Different from the classical Greek, same alphabet, very similar vocabulary, idiomatically going to have some similarities, but classical Greek that would take us back to some of the most ancient writings that we have in classical Greek, in Grecian ancient writings, other than biblical stuff, once since we've got the Dead Sea Scrolls, but even older than that would be what famous writings? And even before Plato. Homer.
Oh, that's right. I'm sorry, I didn't admit.
But Plato did a lot of writing too. Yeah, okay. But yeah, the Iliad and the Odyssey is probably what you had in mind, right, with the works of Homer. Although we're not even sure if he indeed is the author. And we have no original copies of any Homer's work. But nobody doubts it at all, okay? So, what I want to close on, because I think the other class are going to be coming in here, is that Greek was spoken in the Aegean world for over 3,500 years, boast of literature reaching back as far as 800 BC. The oldest monuments, in fact, here it is right here, Greek literature are the two epics of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Very interesting, okay? So, in any case, this language is going to be very, very important to our biblical evidence and to authenticity, to how old things are, and corresponds to what we are finding out archaeologically. Absolutely corresponding to it. Okay. Let me have any final questions, because we've got to get started with the other worship right away. Anybody, final comments or questions at all? Does it all make a little bit of sense? Okay. Thank you very much.